behind the razor wire of Rikers Island. Life never looked like the glossy mugshots or courtroom sketches splashed across newspapers. The cameras captured Tupac Shakur in a still frame, chin lifted, eyes hard, the picture of defiance. But the lens could never show the roaches darting across the floor, the stench of sewage climbing the stairwells, or the quiet sound of a man who had already survived 5 bullets suddenly realizing he had no shield here. Rikers didn't care who you were, rap star, poet, hustler, prophet. Inside those walls, you were just another number fighting to breathe. Guards called it Gladiator School. The name wasn't an exaggeration. Cells overflowed, hallways reeked of rust and sweat, and every day was another round in a war nobody signed up for. In 2023 alone, the facility logged nearly 7,000 use of force incidents, a statistic that stretched like a shadow back to the mid-90s when Pac first walked through the gates. It was a place where teenagers handed razors to one another like candy, where officers blurred the line between control and chaos by feeding the violence instead of stopping it. No one walked away clean. You were predator or prey, and Tupac's fame only painted a bigger target on his back. His cellmate remembers mice chewing through socks at night and puddles forming under bunks when pipes burst. Guards taunted inmates by dangling solitary confinement like a prize. To them, isolation wasn't punishment, it was leverage. And in those first nights, even Tupac, the man who rapped about pain like it was his second skin, started jolting awake, drenched in sweat, convinced the gunfire hadn't stopped. One officer described the environment as a second-by-second attack on your soul. That was the breaking point. Not the bruises or the hunger, but the realization that Rikers was designed to dismantle identity until you forgot who you were. The weight of it twisted relationships too. Behind the myth of thug life was a man clawing for something soft. That's why one of the most surprising stories to surface years later still shocks people. The night Tupac proposed to Jada Pinkett Smith from his cell. It wasn't the romantic headline fans imagined. It was survival. Jada herself admitted it. He didn't want a wedding, he wanted an anchor. He needed someone tethered to him, a witness to remind him he was more than a statistic in a broken system. Her refusal wasn't cold, it was brutally honest. She knew marrying him in that moment wouldn't save him. It would only mask the storm that was already swallowing him whole. For Pac, the rejection cut deeper than steel bars. Trust dissolved. Every handshake, every whispered promise became a test of loyalty. Who was standing beside him and who was waiting to cash in when he fell. Even allies he'd known since childhood started to feel like potential liabilities. His music kept climbing the charts. Me Against the World reached millions, but inside that cell, every lyric was written against the hum of despair. The myth of the untouchable outlaw was still alive outside, but inside, he was just a man in a dirty undershirt trying not to fold under pressure. And yet, it wasn't only Tupac who carried the scars of Rikers. Decades earlier, his mother, Afeni Shakur, had fought her own battle inside those same walls. While 5 months pregnant with him, she faced a 300-year sentence, representing herself in court, demanding boiled eggs and milk just to stay alive long enough to give birth. Tupac grew up with that legacy etched into his DNA: bars before birth, chains before fame. Rikers didn't just claim him in 1995. It had already claimed his family long before the world ever heard his name. That's the cruel irony. By the time Pac landed in that cell, his story wasn't new. It was inherited. Generational scars passed down in courtroom transcripts and cold meals. And as his cellmate would later say, Rikers wasn't just a prison for Tupac, it was a curse that had been waiting for him since the day he was born. The walls of Rikers didn't just echo with violence. They trapped secrets that never made it into any courtroom transcript. One of the most haunting accounts comes from a former correctional officer who claimed survival wasn't measured in years but in seconds. Every minute demanded a choice: reveal weakness and invite predators, or bury your fear so deep it poisoned you from the inside. Tupac Shakur learned fast that fame meant nothing here. Instead of admiration, it drew envy and resentment. And every shout down the corridor carried the weight of a possible ambush. Those who shared space with him remember the transformation vividly. The defiant swagger the world saw on stage gave way to restless pacing, whispered prayers, and an unshakable paranoia. Nights blurred into mornings as he jolted awake from nightmares, convinced he was still under fire. Guards laughed at his unease, some even egging it on, because for them, breaking a man was entertaining. They knew the stories, every inmate did, about the suicides in the first week, about teenagers dangling from bed sheets while officers turned the other way. It was a cycle, and Tupac, no matter how strong his exterior, wasn't immune. The strain twisted deeper when promises began to pile up. Locked in a cage, words became currency. Every letter, every late-night call was a transaction of loyalty, a pledge that someone outside still mattered. Associates would later whisper about 3 particular vows Tupac made during his stretch. One was the desperate proposal to Jada Pinkett Smith, which he framed as a lifeline. Another, insiders claim, was a binding loyalty to death row, sealed by Suge Knight's bailout. The third, the most chilling, was an alleged pact with heavyweight champion Mike Tyson. Each promise became a thread in a web he could never untangle, even after he walked free. The Tyson story lingers like a ghost in hip-hop history. Multiple insiders insist Pac swore an oath with Tyson in those final months, a vow of vengeance if either man was targeted. Tyson himself, years later, teared up remembering their last handshake backstage in Las Vegas. Whether or not the pact was real almost doesn't matter. What mattered was that people believed it. And in the streets, belief is often deadlier than truth. The idea of 2 of the most recognizable names in America bound by a blood promise was enough to rattle rivals and unsettle entire crews. That fear alone could make powerful men decide Pac was too dangerous to let live. Outside the bars, the myth of invincibility only grew. Me Against the World soared, filling airwaves with raw reflections of betrayal and survival. Fans saw strength, insiders saw crack. They watched a man trying to balance the weight of a movement with the suffocating pressure of invisible deaths. For every platinum record, another hand reached out, demanding he honor a promise made in the dark. He wasn't just a musician anymore. He was collateral, bound by obligations that blurred the line between personal loyalty and lethal contracts. Meanwhile, investigators tracing the bloodlines of violence found eerie connections. When Dwayne "Cappy" D. Davis was indicted decades later, court filings revived whispers of million-dollar bounties and ties stretching back to the East Coast, West Coast feud. Old names surfaced, old threats resurfaced, and the circle of suspicion widened to include everyone from rival rappers to moguls like Sean Diddy Combs. The suggestion that Diddy himself might have ordered a hit, fueled by Davis's confessions, reignited the belief that Tupac's fate wasn't random, it was orchestrated. The prison had poisoned everything, even love. Jada's rejection, though rooted in compassion, fractured one of the few bonds Pac believed he could trust. Friends recall phone calls where his voice shook, stripped of the bravado fans adored. He wasn't angry, he was broken. Every relationship felt like a negotiation, every alliance another ticking clock. If love itself was contaminated by despair, what chance did loyalty or friendship have of surviving? And if every promise he made was now binding, then his freedom wasn't freedom at all. It was another sentence served outside the bars. Rikers was never just about confinement. It was about rewriting the rules of Tupac's life, until every step he took was marked by suspicion. Survival inside meant compromise, and compromise outside meant danger. By the time the gates opened, he wasn't walking into freedom. He was stepping into a minefield where each decision, each alliance, carried the weight of invisible contracts signed in desperation. The night lights of Las Vegas burned brighter than any prison bulb, but for Tupac Shakur, they carried the same unease as the echoes of Rikers Island. The camera showed him smiling, dapping hands with Mike Tyson, striding into the crowd like a man untouchable. Yet those who knew him swear his eyes never stopped scanning the room, measuring every face for survival instincts don't fade when you've lived in a cage. They only sharpen. And if the rumors of a secret pact with Tyson were true, that night wasn't just another fight night, it was a staging ground for promises made in blood. The Vegas Strip had always been a theater for excess, but in September 1996, it became a chessboard where rivals watched every move. Death Row Records was riding high, but enemies circled like sharks. Whispers of $1 million bounty floated through back rooms. Crews aligned with Bad Boy were seen prowling, fueling speculation that Pac's every step was being tracked. The East Coast-West Coast feud wasn't just about lyrics or egos anymore. It was about territory, money, and survival, and Pac had become the lightning rod for all of it. In the crowd that night, alliances blurred. Friends and foes often shared the same spaces, sometimes even the same drinks. But behind the smiles were calculations. Pac's own entourage was split. Some believed he was on the verge of turning a corner, talking about peace and building something lasting. Others whispered he was bound by debts he couldn't escape, tethered to men whose loyalty was only as deep as the next payoff. Every handshake carried history and every glance hinted at betrayal. The FBI would later raid homes tied to figures connected with the case, dragging old ghosts back into the spotlight. But on that September night, it wasn't federal agents Pac feared, it was the invisible contracts still tugging at him. Those vows made in darkness, to friends, to allies, to lovers, hung over him like chains. You can't walk away from promises when the people you made them to live in a world where betrayal means death. That's what haunted him most. Freedom wasn't real, it was rented, and the payment was always due. When the bullets finally ripped through the Vegas air, conspiracy theories ignited like wildfire. Was it revenge for an old street beef? Payback for Suge Knight's power plays? Or the consequence of the Tyson Pact, an alliance that made Pac too threatening for his enemies to tolerate? Even decades later, the answers remain tangled in a web of half-truths and whispered testimony. Dwayne Keffy D. Davis's indictment only deepened the mystery, hinting at rivalries and money trails, but leaving more shadows than light. Each revelation feels like a piece of the puzzle, yet the picture never quite completes. The tragedy is that Tupac wasn't just a rapper gunned down in Vegas. He was a man carrying invisible weight, crushed by generational scars and promises forged in desperation. His mother had once fought for survival in the same brutal complex that later caged her son. That cycle of incarceration and resilience defined their family story. It wasn't fate that cornered him, it was the system, the culture of violence, and the burden of vows that outlived their purpose. Even today, Pac's legacy pulses with contradictions. To fans, he remains a prophet whose words still shake speakers and stir souls. To insiders, he was a man marked by paranoia, struggling under obligations that made his every move a gamble. And to the industry, he became both martyr and myth, a cautionary tale wrapped in platinum plaques. The truth is simpler and harsher. He was human. He bled, he broke, and he sought love and loyalty in places that couldn't give it back. As federal investigations continue to circle names from that era, as raids uncover hidden tapes, and lawsuits drag moguls back into headlines, one question refuses to die. Was Tupac Shakur doomed by the bullets in Vegas or by the promises he made when survival demanded them? Every theory points to the same chilling reality. His story didn't end in Nevada. It was written years earlier, behind bars, in whispers, in oaths, in the cracks of trust that never healed. And that's why, all these years later, the legend isn't at rest. The ghost of Rikers still lingers, and the truth, whatever it is, waits in the shadows, daring someone to finally drag it into the light.